5 minutes and 15 seconds.
Okay. Just a reminder that I would prefer verbal POIs. Thank you. Speaker, we live in a world where there is so much inequality and humans are inherently selfish, making improper decisions in a free market. That is why we regret the imposition of the neoliberal world order, meaning that we think that the world would be better if this had never existed. I'm going to start by giving some characterization, then I'm going to go into 2 points. First, on how it makes up for human irrationality. Second, on how it causes how we're able to reduce inequality on Gov. So first, on some characterization, we think that there are a lot of things that consist of this neoliberal world order, but what is most important is the economic policy, because ultimately the costs of prices impact our behavior in terms of our employment, in terms of our consumption, and just so many other facets. Then onto some characterization as to what these policies look like. First, we think that on Gov side, we have things like government intervention in case government believes it is necessary. And tools to do so include things like taxes, subsidies, price floors, outright bans, and things like that. And we think that on ops side of the house, none of this is present. Everything is up to the free market to determine. So now, how we are going to make up for human irrationality on Gov side of the house. When a person buys a product, they consider the benefit that they get, and they consider the cost that it is, right? We think that when these two prices match up, they buy a product, which leads to like a business being able to prosper off of that demand. But we think that this is irrational because they only consider the benefit that they get themselves. In the sense that, for example, if somebody wants to buy a cigarette, they consider the happiness that they get from using that cigarette, but they don't consider what like the environmental aspect, because humans tend to be selfish and think about themselves and the benefit that they receive, but they don't think about the environment. I think the government is the only person that is able to intervene in this circumstance. And what could they do? For example, they can tax a good, right? So if the price of the cigarette is higher, well then like the amount of benefit that they believe they're going to get is still the same, well then like the cigarette becomes less worth it, right? I think ultimately what this does is that through things like taxes and bans, you're able to discourage people from buying products that are bad for them or bad for like third parties that are not involved in a transaction. We think it works on the flip side as well. For example, if there are certain cases where the benefit of a good might be underestimated. For example, if like you get a vaccine, sure, you help yourself to prevent yourself from getting a disease, but you also help the environment as a whole, the ability of the healthcare system to deal with like an epidemic or a pandemic. And we think that the government is able to encourage people to take more rational decisions that benefit both themselves and their community through this. For example, they can do things like provide paid leave for people that need to take a day off to get vaccinated. Second, we want to talk about inequality, because only in a place where we don't have a neoliberal world order and the government intervenes in places where there is a market failure can you have things like welfare systems and tax systems that allow people to redistribute income. We think that there are a few things here. First is like this you're able to get things like welfare, but also you can get things like free education and healthcare. We think that on ops side of the house, poor communities are unable to afford this because it is so expensive, because it's all going to be run by private businesses. However, on Gov side, we change that, right? Because free education and healthcare are very fundamental to human well-being. If you're healthy, you're able to go out to the workforce and like
Why?
be productive. I'll take time is running out. We think that like if you're educated, you probably are able to get a higher standard of living. I think this is very crucial in decreasing the wealth gap between the rich and the poor and uplifting the poor. We think also that the government has the ability to take a command and control approach. This looks No, thank you. This looks like labor regulations, for example, that prevent like profit-driven corporations from just exploiting workers, not giving them a fair wage, or like wages that don't keep up with inflation, or like making them work long hours or using child labor. We think that all of this exploitation is likely to happen on Ob's side of the house if the poor are desperate and corporations want to make money. But on Gov's side, because the government is like legally powerful, and they're able to do this, we think that they're able to prevent things like labor exploitation, which also helps the poor. So what have I proven to you today? I've talked about why this imposition has why on Gov we're able to make up for human irrationality and help inequality by reducing it on that basis. So proud to propose.
Great, I thank that speaker for that fine speech, and now would like to call upon the leader of the opposition to open up the case for side opposition. Hear, hear.
Am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right, time starts in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to be providing a couple of things for you in my speech today. First, I'll provide some framing to explain what this neoliberal world order will actually look like. Then I'll provide 2 contentions, first on the benefits that can be derived from the free market system and improved international relations. All right, first let's do some framing. So this system, the neoliberal world order, will be operating on an international level with international organizations like the UN at the forefront. I would like to point out that these international organizations are generally committed to things like development and equality and positive goals that aim to focus on the most marginalized and vulnerable stakeholders in the world and improve their circumstances. I would also like to add that in the phrasing of the motion and the info slide that was given, we talk about limited state intervention. I like to point out that this does not mean zero. A lot of the points that government has tried to come up and present to you, like for example, the ones about the welfare system and paid leave, those things are necessary for the functioning of society. There is no way that just because we have a free market system, we're going to impose suddenly completely oppressive systems. I do acknowledge that we will have some limited regulation, but the points that government is trying to put forward are the absolute extremes and should not be held as the truth in this debate. I would also like to point out that because these international organizations are going to be committed to things like development and equality, they're not going to allow for major collapses to happen. For example, the Great Depression, especially considering that this is a lot higher stakes system that's being implemented since it exists on an international level. And presumably they're going to have top economists, politicians, etc., guiding the imposition to ensure that there is no collapse. I'd also like to point out that the system is not inevitably going to be permanent. So for corporations to continue to reap the benefits of the free market, they must to some extent align themselves with the goals of international organizations like the UN. So if we can prove that the system will support the goals of the international organizations operating the system, we win this debate. On to my first contention. So let's talk a bit about the free market benefits of competition. So government regulation looks like restrictions on output, prices, access to resources, for example, access to resources across countries, like with trade restrictions like tariffs. So what this means is that it narrows the scope by which companies can differentiate their products, since they are limited to similar quality and pricing within certain regions, which are the main metrics by which organizations can compete. So what does deregulation do? This allows corporations to expand the scope of resources they can utilize and compete to a far greater extent on quality and price. So what does this mean? People can receive higher quality goods and services at an even lower price. So what are the kind of goods that can come out of this? International organizations with humanitarian goals are at the forefront of the system. Innovation generated by competition will likely be directed towards supporting these goals, so that the companies who are benefiting from it, either in terms of profit, like government has tried to push forward for you, are still able to continue to make that profit because they need to continue to align themselves with these goals. As long as what they're doing works with the UN or whatever international organization, they will be allowed to continue. So essentially what this could look like is innovating effective, cheaper options for sustainable practices. Things like this would benefit people in lower income communities and the global south, especially since the global south are countries where they face the worst of the proxy waste provided by global north countries and are also the most likely to receive the worst of the harms of climate change. For example, being in geographically risky locations, where they might be exposed to things like tsunamis, earthquakes, heat waves, etc., and the fact that they are generally lower income and cannot afford protections from the effects of climate change like the global north can. Even if you don't buy that the innovation will go towards such goals, the rapid generation of new goods will still provide a lot of benefit in terms of creating jobs that can support the employment crisis, which can in turn provide work opportunities to lower income communities and provide them with the mobility needed to escape their lower quality lifestyles. Furthermore, the benefit of higher quality and lower prices means that these can be appreciated by people from lower income communities. Intention and started off so that my partner can continue it on improving international relations through trade. With this motion, tariffs and quotas are not going to exist, enabling us to have a more free trade market internationally. This is going to look like having more trade in the international market, especially between different nations, because there are now more accessible trade options between these nations. Businesses are also going to be incentivized to trade with others across different countries because naturally there are some products that are only available for production in certain areas. Like, for example, how Ukraine is one of the biggest providers of grain and US is one of the biggest providers of technology, or excel in production in certain areas. When we create a free market with this motion, we make the grounds more available for a give and take option, like a compromise for different businesses all around the world to trade. How are we sure then that we can get international relations through economic trade? When we increase the amount of trade we have between nations, we naturally increase the amount of communication between the nations that are trading and have a sort of positive relation through the forging of compromises, considering we also get more successful trades between nations where both parties get what they desire, their impression of each other naturally also gets better. We essentially increase interaction between nations through the free market and we link more international markets together. This is especially good since our world is in such a rigid state between nations where there is constant tension, and we could ease this through increasing trade and benefiting both economies in different nations. Thank you.
I thank that speaker for that fine speech, and now I'd like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for side government. Hear, hear.
Okay, 1 second. Once again, verbal POIs, and yeah, my timer begins in 3, 2, 1. Speaker, I think that throughout this round, we have mainly boiled down to 2 clashes. Firstly, on which side leads to a more considerate society, or just overall better like benefits for society. And second of all, on which side is better for the common individual. I'll be explaining why Anna takes the win on both of those important clashes. But before that, let's talk about some of the major problems we see in OO. Oh, it basically tells you a few things. It tells you that intervention still still exists on their side, you know, and basically their whole the first 30 seconds of their speech basically says that our case is too extreme. Sure, that obviously intervention still exists to some degree on both sides, but it's not enough for OO to win on that because our side also has a degree of free markets anyways. But overall, it just means less protection, which even a marginal decrease cracks down immensely on the lower classes. And okay, then they also go on to tell you that people basically get better quality goods at lower prices because of this increase in competition. Look, this is an overused argument because businesses on both sides of the house will still invest a lot on producing the best goods, right? Because in one world, this sort of neoliberalism affects all businesses. So because because both businesses on both sides of the house are still driven by finance, they're still going to be trying to produce the maximum amount they're going to still be trying to produce the best goods that they can put out into the market. What is unclear to me then is the lower prices argument, because on our side at least the government can regulate prices. This is extremely prominent in necessary goods like medicine or just other super necessary goods, but also with less government intervention, it makes it a bit harder for businesses to start up, because basically every business that wants to start up has to work on their own and gain that money or support on their own, versus on our side where there's actually relatively more government support. But then lastly, national trade. They talk about national trade, not sure how this actually increases on their side, because on our side, national trade can still happen with government intervention. In fact, it does, it just does, right? Okay, but then let's go on to the first clash on which side actually leads to overall more benefits for society. Note here that whether people's actual mindsets about how they want to impact society is changed or not is not what the round is about, but much rather what Anna wants to focus on is the visible impacts that come at the end of neoliberalism. Therefore, if we prove to you at the end of this round that we are able to see a world that has visible positive impacts of less actions performed that actively harm society and environment, we win on that basis. How does this work? People are basically forced to take the benefits the benefits of society into consideration. Why is this? Because Anna already tells you that most people are just inherently selfish, especially the people who care a lot about their money. They're not just super rich, they have a lot of money to spend, therefore they mostly care about themselves. Okay, this is especially prominent for the majority of people given the framing, but also to businesses as well. So both consumers and businesses are vastly affected by the money. It is a large driving factor to the decisions they make. The delta here then is that the government has less of an incentive to care for money compared to the other two stakeholders. Therefore, by regulating the economy and the way money is spent by people or gained by people, they are actually able to use that to regulate and control a lot of other societal issues, if, for example, imposing taxes on unhealthy foods, alcohol, etc. But also, even if this doesn't necessarily work and have a large impact, note the principle here is that because Anna has proven why the government is the best actor and the most rational here, it is in their moral responsibility to try to regulate the country through their power anyways. Now let's go on to the second clash on which side is actually better for the common individual. Let's look at it from this lens. I.e., which world would you rather live in without any prior knowledge of your identity, social class, etc., right? We think that sure, for the upper class, in a world where there's less government intervention on their businesses, no thank you, they are more likely to prosper. They obviously like that world more. However, the probability that you actually end up in the life of an upper class person who owns a huge business compared to that of just landing in the average life of a middle class citizen is way lower. Therefore, by logic, you'd want to play it safe and want to live in a world that government supports, which is a world in which there is more than less government intervention. Government intervention here, because has been stated that it is the strongest force that can actually protect these people two ways. Firstly, allows for business owners or just rich people to be less likely to take advantage of the poor people, but also just more government intervention to support public sectors that mostly benefit poor people, such as free healthcare, community centers, or free education. And for those reasons, so proud to propose.
Great, I thank that speaker for that fine speech. Now to close top half, I call the DLO. Hear, hear.
Oh, just a second, I'll set up my timer. Okay, just to reiterate, I take verbal POIs and she, her pronouns. Okay, cool. Time to start my first word then. Huddle, as your DLO, my main thing to do for you today is several things. First of all, I want to kind of differentiate ourselves from potentially what's going to be coming up from our back half. And then I want to move on to some reconstruction from my partner's arguments. And then last but not least, on the refutation of our two OG speakers. Cool, then I want to first move on differentiation. So I think what my partner have brought to you today is two main things, right? First of all, on the idea of kind of improving the product range. So first of all, how that we're going to be having more competition within our society. We're going to be having more good priced goods, and at the same time also good quality goods. And at the same time, we're also going to be improving the climate because we're kind of encouraging innovation, especially under this kind of supervision of international organizations with humanitarian goals. We also tell you then in our second argument how that we're not going to be improving international relations through trade, which we don't think they're all really understood. I haven't really even said anything yet. Either way, so I think that arguments, we are able to prove to you today how that we are generally on the large scale internationally and also domestically within different countries going to be able to create a better life for all of our citizens, especially because we have more free trade, meaning we're going to be having better kind of international relations with different countries. But at the same time, we also create our lives better for our citizens because now our quality is going to be, our products are going to be much better quality and at the same time, better price. At the same time, we also care for the global south and also for our climate. That means that generally then we have often covered a lot of the debate for our opposition bench, meaning that whatever is going to be coming up from our back half is likely still going to be an analysis based and not going to be over covering our content because we have already set the round up and covered so much. Okay, cool. Then I want to move on to reconstruction to my partner's arguments. So her first argument is on how kind of there's going to be improved product range, and our opponent tried to take this down by saying then that people are still going to be trying to get the best goods, try to make the best quality goods on their side of the house, how that contention one still happens on government side as well. But notice then the largest difference between their side and our side is that our government regulation is just so much looser, right? Meaning that all of our companies have so much more resources. They are so much more resources, whether like production-wise, and at the same time also from raw materials, meaning that we have so much more opportunities for them to create better prices. At the same time, we also create more competition because it is not just domestic competition without all these tariffs and quotas, but also it is international competitions. What this means is then our businesses are even more incentivized to create the best quality products and best price products. We don't see that happening on government at all. Our second contention then is on the idea that we're going to be having, I'll take you later, is that we're going to be improving international relations with trade. Understand this point by saying that national trade still happens at this house. First, I want to reiterate it is international relations through trade, right? We're talking about politics. But we say that this kind of international trade does not happen on their side of the house because there is so much quotas and tariffs that's happening on their side of the house that is not eased through anything on their side. I'll take you.
Would you agree that international trade encourages countries to resort to cheap labor and harmful environmental practices to lower their prices and make their goods competitive?
Okay, cool. I'm just about to move on to that because I'm going to be refuting your arguments. So on OG then, for PM, we get this, I'll deal with this first then. On their second contention, how they talk about inequality, how that only on government can they actually have welfare and free education and healthcare. And they said that things are all going to be ran on private businesses so that some things need to be controlled by the government to actually give basic things to those with lower income. They also say how there's going to be exploitation of workers and child labor that will still exist in opposition. First of all, I want to say that this is just too much extreme of a case, right? No matter what, all businesses are still going to be like under the control by law. I think justice systems are going to exist on either side of the house, right? If you was to resort at the end of the day to child labor and like exploiting the workers, our law is still going to be like covering all of that. I think then that in our case, we have presented several contentions that will still benefit all these like minority stakeholders because we cover for the global south and we benefit actually right, from innovation directed towards climate change and its impacts, and that consumers globally benefit from lower prices and high quality goods and services, especially lower income communities. And the citizens globally benefit from positive international relations. But not even that, UN and humanitarian like goals oriented organizations are going to be on the forefront of this kind of free market. That means that they also are able to kind of keep all of these businesses in check. And then because countries will naturally specialize based on the resources available, foreign countries are incentivized to improve the political or social standing of people within those regions such that they continue to be able to produce for such trade agreements. For example, with Ukraine, a major provider of grain, countries everywhere are not only motivated by the unjust actions by Russia to improve the situation in the country, but also because Ukraine is so heavily relied upon as a provider. And so what does that mean? Is that countries struggling with political, economic, and or social issues can now benefit from the incentives foreign countries have to improve the standing of these countries, improving the quality of life for people within these countries. So proud to
Great, I thank that speaker for that fine speech, and I thank all speakers on top half. To open up the back half of this debate, I'd like to call upon the member of government. Here.
Just confirming that I'm clearly audible and visible.
Or both.
Panel, the opening half focuses on the middle class average person in the world. CG will tell you why the global poor benefit at large on our side. We make sure the entire developing nations are uplifted on our side. Extremely proud to stand with CG. Two things I'm going to do in this speech. First, on two extensions. First, on developing nations. Second, on benefiting buyers. Second, I'm just going to take out OG and O from this round, right? First, on extensions. First extension on how developing nations are much better on our side. The premise of this argument is that MNCs will come into these countries on our side. Two reasons why. One, the government doesn't intervene due to the market being a free market in the first place. They're less likely to impose regulations and things like that. It's relatively easier for MNCs to come in the first place. But B, local corporations in developing nations simply do not have enough money to in these countries in the first place, and MNCs always outbid these people in buying. They always are able to set up better deals in the first place. What is the problem? What is the problem in opposition's world, right? I think it's four main things. One, this exploitation of resources by developing nations, because developing nations can afford to keep switching countries between other developing nations in the first place, right? So MNCs have incentives to exploit resources and maximize profits in the short term. B, the money flows out of developing nations, right? Because it's foreign shareholding of these MNCs in the first place. So whatever profits they generate inside developing nations all flow out. The developing nations themselves don't benefit. See, this employment of foreigners, right? Foreigners are just more educated because of more sophisticated education systems, and because these companies are inherently just have foreign shareholding, they're much more likely to employ foreigners in the first place, which means the people who are actually employed from these companies are foreigners, not locals. D, there's low tariffs, right? The government wants to keep these corporations within the country to continue producing products for the country because the government doesn't intervene, which means that the money that's generated from these MNCs and in the form of taxes and tariffs is extremely negligible. What's the harm of this? I think there's two main harms of this. One, the country itself doesn't benefit in terms of economic output and economic progress, but B, the locals still suffer because there's a lack of jobs within the country. They aren't employed. But why are the locals most important in this debate? Two reasons. One, they're poor in comparison to the rest of the world. Not these people in developing countries. Two, they have the lack of capacity to uplift themselves in the first place. How do we solve this? We solve this with three main things. One is non-exploitation. The government or local companies have incentives to maintain those resources for long periods of time. They do not have the option to continue to move out to other countries. Second, the money remains within the country. Whatever profits are generated remain within the country. So third, even if there's no profit generated, at least there's some amount of employment that's created. Second extension, then how we benefit buyers on our side. The premise of this is there's few corporations in these countries because only MNCs come into these countries. There's no local companies, which means there's less competition than there would exist on opposition, right? What is the problem? I think there are three problems that exist. One, there's bad quality products, i.e. MNCs can get away with creating bad quality products because there's no better quality products that exist because of the less competition. B, there's highly priced products because these products may be essential. They're highly priced because there's no because of the few corporations, they aren't actually reducing the price of these products. But see, they can't be called out, right? No, the locals aren't shareholders in these companies, which means they don't have they can't vote in these companies in the first place, so they can't call them out for doing wrong things or like that. What is harm of this? I think MNCs get to export goods if they're good quality because the locals can't buy them because of the high price, or if they're bad quality, they remain in the country. Either way, locals suffer. We told you that locals are the most important people in this debate. What is solvency on this, right? We told you that we have much more accountability on our side of the house at the point at which the government can be held accountable by voting. The government is accountable and responsible to the voters in the first place, which means that they have incentive to produce good quality products. They have incentives to do the right things within the countries with the right incentives. The impacts of this is locals benefit much more on our side. Quickly taking OG and O out of this. First, we got two main claims from OG, right? One, on environmental impact, I think this is symmetric. The government won't earn money if they don't sell products and make money. So they have incentives to keep selling those products in the first place. But second, they told us about free education and healthcare. I think this debate is not about economic intervention. So this is again in this thing that remains from OG at the end of this is that the government somehow stops human rights violations and things like that because the government regulates important things like this. I think we mechanize this properly in our accountability arguments. So if anything, this claim should come to us. Everything else will be proved to you is exclusive material that we gave you that OG didn't. What did O tell you? O told you two main things. One, the deregulation improves quality somehow, and it improves quality somehow, right? I urge you to look at developing countries. Two responses to this. One, it is simply untrue. You are in developing nations, you have few companies, so you get away with that quality. Two, even if it's true, companies simply jack up prices due to few corporations within the country. Second argument we got from them, increased trade. One, I think this is bad. Developing nations on their side are forced to sell goods at very low prices because there's no minimum price or other such regulations that governments can impose. But two, government regulation is mostly internal. Democracies and status quo just simply still have trade restrictions in the first place, which means that entire IR argument falls. They have no material left in this debate. We have better quality of goods, even if they have better, even if the quality of goods is symmetric on both sides. The locals argument is exclusive. For all it is the mention of my speech, quote CG.
Great, I thank that speaker for that fine speech, and now I'd like to call upon the member of the opposition to continue the case for side opposition. Hear, hear.
Hello, I assume I'm audible and visible.
Yep.
POIs in chat, probably from opening FF time. A couple of observations I want to make. Number one, some countries will still be neoliberal on both sides, right? Probably these countries look like US, it looks like the West, right? Because these ideas originated there in the first place, because the motion tells us imposition of these ideas. So like the difference is on their side, the East is not neoliberal, on our side it is. But secondly, I love how OG just tries to frame out democracy. Obviously, they can't frame out democratic norms, because I think that is something which came by this neoliberal norm, something I'll talk about further, a bunch of things. The first thing I want to show you is why the quality of state control is really bad, right? So why they have really bad incentives when making the state control, and the impact of this is simple. The first thing it's going to do is take out OG from the round, because they say state control, but I'll show you why state control is actually going to happen in a bad way. But second is the way to access OOs like mechanisms and benefit. Number one, I think governments usually have short-term incentives, right? That is to say they want to win the next election, right? How will they win the next election? By giving freebies to people, white elephant like monument, right? Which makes it look like the country is doing really well when it isn't, right? So when CG says electoral mechanisms, that is true. But the way those electoral mechanisms manifest is, instead of investing in long-term growth, they do things like which are like popular to people in the now, but are really harmful for the economy. This is the kind of control you have on that side. Secondly, states are really beholden to lobbying power, right? Because not oftentimes it is about developing countries, as CG says, but that's the point at which you have lobbying power. That is, you have big corporations which have control over the government. Number three, even if they do policies, likely to be performative change and performative policies, because all they need to do is just like portray the image that they're doing well to the voters rather than actually doing anything well. This proves that they don't have an incentive to do good. But even if they did have an incentive to do good, I posit that they don't have the capacity to actually make good control, because of the simple reason that developing countries in general lack resources and lack time, and also there's likely to be very little scrutiny on these policies, right? So decisions made by these states are likely to be really bad, right? Because even if in like the best case you assume that all the incentives are good, it's really difficult to ascertain where to intervene, when to impose that maximum price, right? The impact of this is simple. Any state intervention is probably really bad. But secondly, I just want to note that the kind of state intervention that OG and CG are talking about, probably we have at some point like anti-competitive laws and stuff like that. A bunch of other things then on like the economy. The first thing is that why do we actually have more competition? Because like O tells us the benefits of competition without telling us why we have that. The first reason is because nobody actually wants to compete with the government, right? Because they're seen as those big bullies who can literally do anything, right? But secondly, that's the point at which corruption becomes much worse, right? Because of those lobbying powers which I told you, that's the point at which the state control is likely to give like contracts to like these companies which have these lobbying powers, which means you actually have a lot less competition on their side of the house. The second thing I want to tell you under this is that like also this like competition and ability to be successful will actually raise entrepreneurial incentives and actually get a lot more innovation on our side of the house. But thirdly, why is it that the government is necessarily inefficient, and why are we a lot more efficient? The first thing to point out is that like companies are profit oriented, right? So that's the point where they actually have a incentive to like be more efficient. They have an incentive to reduce like their raw material costs such that they can make the most profit possible, right? Whereas on the other hand, like the government literally does not care about profit so much, right? The important thing to note is that economic growth eventually trickles down to people. But secondly, the government is literally so big, right? At that point, you have things like diseconomies of scale, and it's really difficult to be efficient. But thirdly, you have so much bureaucracy within the government, right? Which means that even in the best case, the government is just inefficient when it controls things. Why are individuals much better to make? Why are individuals capable of making good decisions? The first is to say that they know their conditions the best, right? They know whether they want that like cloth for whatever price. But secondly, and this is like responsive to OG, but secondly, I think information is spreading a lot such that individuals can like account for things like environmental change. Why are private firms necessarily more accountable? Number one, because private firms have like media incentives, right? Because their brand image really matters. But also in the case of MNCs that CG wanted to talk about, people in the US really care about if MNCs are doing exploitation in like India, for example, right? Which means that they actually have a lot more accountability than the government and are likely to do really, really good things. The second thing I want to talk about is like democracy, right? Because note these places probably had kind of authoritarian unlike democracy is really shaky there. Right? You have majoritarian leaders. This looks like places like Turkey. It looks like places where voter election and rigging is a very real issue. In their world, what happens is there is no incentive for them not to be involved in the election process in a way that makes voter fraud likely and possible, right? So it's in their world when you have things like centralized power, which actually means you don't have the democratic view actually heard on their side. Why does this norm necessarily mean that states must be more democratic? Number one, now you have more global pressure and must answer to the global market, right? This norm feels like, it means that like countries in the US feel justified in doing things like sanction. It means they feel justified in like doing like trade things, so to like ensure that these developing states actually become more democratic. Second, this norm means that people actually recognize the value of democracy a lot more, right? Because the free market means you're more exposed to more ideals, but also this means you have greater bargaining power. But thirdly, the motion slide literally gives us fiat, right? If it is the imposition of this, then they must use mechanisms like the UN to ensure this happens, right? Which means at the end of the day, even if we like don't buy any of the economic stuff, we literally prove we get more democracy, and democracy is literally the most important thing. Vote CEO.
Great, I thank that speaker for that fine speech. Now to close proposition bench, I'd like to call upon the government whip. Here.
Perfect. Am I audible and visible?
Yep.
Awesome. Just give me a second. I'm just setting my down. Got it. I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Go. The two biggest things we get from side opposition in this debate is about international relations, and the second thing that CEO gets to us, and the main thing they get to us, is about how government has short-term incentives, will give freebies to people who won't work. First thing, on international relations, I think worst case, like what they do is that they think trade is happening, and that's why international relations is good. But just because there is trade and trade exists does not mean like trade itself is good at all, right? So trade does not mean good relations because the trade itself is not good on their side. We tell you that people are likely to be exploited, and that is exactly why government credibility is likely to be lost. Because when you see your labor jobs, the people themselves are going to be worse off. The people themselves are going to call out the government because of voter power, and because the government cares about these votes, their credibility losing to them is so much more harmful that there's worse relations between the countries themselves when they see that their companies are exploiting East or G's countries, right? But secondly, even in the worst case, even if we assume that developed nations are having good relations, developing nations are much worse because these international relations aren't going to last long, because the trade itself is going to exploit the economy so much, it's going to worsen the developing nations at all in terms of relations. But I'll explain this. Second, just let's frame CEO out of this debate because of this whole idea of giving freebies to people. 3 reasons why this does not work. First, I think even if it happens, people are still likely to realize over the long term that the government is messing up, the government is doing shit to these people, so they'll still call out, right? And that's why this accountability still exists. The government knows that the people can call out if they try to like mess up with their minds, and if they try to just give freebies to people, so they can call out. You don't buy this? Sure. But the second thing is like, this is still better on the comparative that we give you anyways, right? Why is this true? Because when there's a consumer that's still exploited in the long term, because the MNC controls the big market, it's a monopoly in any stake. So that's why it's going to exploit the consumers by rising up the prices, right? Our comparative is still existing. Like even if it is the short term, on the long term, we aren't exploiting the consumers. Even in short term, we are benefiting the consumers anyways, right? And I think this matters the most in third world countries where these people are the most vulnerable and they need these short term benefits. They need the consumers to be happy in the short term because in the long term, they're not beneficial anyways. They're the most vulnerable to poverty in so many situations that these short term benefits are the most important. But or about CEO and being our extensions. I think I already weighed CEO out of this debate, so I'll come up with OO and what they talked about. I think on the international relations thing, 3 reasons why this does not work. Like first, positive relations with trade and developed nations already exist with good trade. I think something which our opening already pointed out doesn't really work, right? But secondly, I think when MNCs take up over this trade, I already proved in my opening, like just because there is trade does not mean good relations, because the trade itself becomes so bad. The trade, because of the MNCs, is exploiting the country, which is why the country itself is not going to have good credibility when the people feel that they exploited themselves. And if the country knows that the people are themselves being exploited and the people calls out the government for them being exploited, that's not having good relations because of the trade being bad, because the MNCs are controlling the entire trade. The government has no accountability to even control the trade in the first place, right? And I also told you this is why this is bad for developing nations, something we brought up in our extension, extremely important. They're the most vulnerable in this debate. Also, this whole idea then again on creating jobs, 3 reasons this doesn't work, right? First, I think third world countries, and this is important because third world countries again are the most vulnerable for these labor jobs, right? They'll only be getting these labor jobs, which means they have no chance to grow in the long term, which is what opposition wants to talk about. So in the long term, they're still getting labor jobs because MNCs are likely to export jobs from outside internationally because they don't want to pay so many people in these third world countries, right? Which themselves mean like the third world economy is likely to be bad in the long term. At least we have something that's better, that is accountability, which means like the domestic economy is still protected of these third world countries because the MNC is not coming in and taking over the domestic economy. The MNC is not hurting by only giving labor jobs to people. And this accountability mechanism, by the way, only comes in closing, so you can't be opening for this, right? So credit us for that. And third, government regulations can still increase jobs, right? Not like government existing does not mean there won't be jobs because they have an incentive to give the jobs because of accountability, right? I think also on CO talking a lot about like this trickle down effect, because the only thing they talk about is that companies are giving profit, right? And giving profit is good for these companies. Getting profit for these companies is inherently good, right? And the only link they give us to this is that the economy trickles down, which is why it's beneficial for people also. First, what does the economy trickle down inherently mean? How is that helping the consumers anyway? No comment on that by the MO. But secondly, like we told you, even if like the economy is so trickling down so slow because the companies still have a profit incentive that they're going to give very less payment to the jobs that are there at the very bottom of the economy. The government cares about these people, which is why they're likely to give them jobs, at least which pay, but they're likely to also growth in the long term, which is why the government cares much more about them. The trickle down effect thing does not work anyways. Weighing the extensions now, I think two main things. First, we give you a more impacting extension. We give you the impact extension on developing nations, which is important. We give you 4 reasons: exploitation of resources, money flowing out, employing foreigners, and tariffs already being low, which means domestic economy is likely to be hurt anyways, right, for these developing nations. They're the most vulnerable in this debate, so we weigh us over our opening for that. But secondly, then again, we give you the whole accountability mechanism, something which our opening does not talk about. Like they only talk about government giving bad products and the environment being worse. But why is the government then better for this, right? They say the government is likely to do all of this stuff, but why? We give the mech that is accountability, something you only get an ask. That's why it's extremely important. But like even if they prove somehow the government is great and our opening proves that, we also tell you why consumers are necessarily bad with MNCs by giving in the link that there's monopoly. That's why they have less accountability and hence they can raise prices. This important link proves like why the consumers are likely to be worse on the side of the opposition. That's exactly why you already weigh us over our opening. For all of these reasons, is exactly why we win over opening, and we already beat the opposition in this debate. For all of these reasons and so many more, so proud to propose.
Great. I thank that speaker for that fine speech. And now to close the debate as a whole, I'd like to call upon the opposition whip. Hear, hear.
Can I confirm that I'm audible?
Yep, you are.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, in my speech, I'll be doing 3 things. Firstly, I'll be rebutting opening gov, moving on to closing, and lastly, showing you why we weigh over our opening team, right? Let's start with OG then. What did they tell us? They tell us that, look, the government will intervene. Like, let's just start with their framing, right? Their framing was that the government will intervene in cases where they believe it's necessary. Here's where we tell you that this becomes very confusing in their world, right? Because the word necessary is something that can be viewed differently depending on the government, but even then, the government can use this idea of necessary to exploit their power over these companies. This is where Sambhav brought in ideas about like majoritarian governments, where they can use this to basically like exploit the agency that people have. Now we also get this idea that, look, in Gov's world, we're going to be making up for human irrationality. This is because like businesses profit off demand for certain products, and like humans are selfish and materialistic. So like the government can use things like taxes and bans to limit or discourage humans from buying certain products, and this could like by extension help the environment. Why do we think this doesn't work in the first place? Firstly, I just think that the government lives in this utopia where everyone sees these policies that like principally reduce their free choice to make independent decisions and takes away their agency, and then like the public just responds by saying, oh yeah, we're okay with this. Firstly, we think on their side of the house, people are still going to like continue to find ways to access these products, except it's more likely to shift into an illegal space. And I think under their own characterization, humans tend to be selfish, so they will resort to ways to access these products illegally. So just like on like where they get this, they don't really get any solvency on their side. But even if you take them at their absolute best and say that all citizens are law abiding, we still think that they hugely exaggerate the depth of their impact, right? This is to say that companies always have an incentive to go green even without government intervention. This is because of things such as like public image, media, etc. There's always going to be advocacy that already exists. So we tend to like they're just on depth of impact, they're losing this. But also like people realize that certain things are bad, right? And even if they're selfish, they still understand the harms. But like worst case, if they're extremely selfish on either side of the house, they're going to access these products in some way or the other.
Secondly, they talk about like reducing inequality and how like with government intervention, like without government intervention, you won't have things like welfare benefits and like free education, healthcare, etc. Again, just like depth of impact on either side of the house, taking them at their best, government will always have a principal obligation to help people. They can't just allow this exploitation and oppression to continue. But why do we think that they don't actually reduce inequality to the extent that they want? In their world, you take economic agency away from so many individuals, limiting their ability to actually learn, like to get a lot of money and be successful. But even then, this money goes to the government. So now that idea of this money benefiting the people through welfare schemes is contingent on the idea that the government is very good and actually cares about people, which we've already shown you that through many cases is not necessarily true. Now, moving on to like the closing half, right? But before I do that, I'll take the POI.
We buy you and your partner's framing on that the government wants to do good in order to get votes, then why isn't that enough an incentive to be competent and not be corrupt and exploit their power?
Yeah, but that was rebuttal that we gave you in your best case, which is that even if the government really wants to help people, that kind of like reduces the depth of impact of so many claims that you made about harms that are going to happen in our side. But then furthermore, we gave you framing for like in more majoritarian countries where the government isn't necessarily good, they aren't necessarily going to be like helping people, right? And we don't think that you interact with this claim because you just assume this motion takes place in like a developed country where like laws are amazing and it's actually benefiting people. Now moving on to like closing half. So then entire case was basically like how MNCs are terrible. Firstly, it's unclear why this is the tipping point, whether or not MNCs come, right? I think this is kind of marginal because there are incentive to do this either way. But secondly, we showed you that it's actually good, right? We told you that they have more accountability because of like media incentives. We tell you how you get discourse of ideas, you become more liberal, and MNCs are more efficient because they have like greater technology. And like what other options they have? Like where's the money coming from? So the comparative is no investment, not government investment. So at least we give jobs. We also go on to tell you about like accountability. We tell you that look, electoral mechanisms, and eventually like people are going to realize, people will, they tell us that look, people electoral mechanisms exist and people will like realize. We tell you that people will not realize because of things like government propaganda. People will always want a freebie right now rather than economic growth in the future because people themselves are also short-termist. We also tell you that state control is bad because of things like short-term incentives and just like want to portray a message of doing well. And I think it's like in their world where you necessarily alienate the developing countries, because I want to know that economic and democratic norms make the world of difference. The Cold War was literally for conflicting economic and political ideas. So when this ideological divide exists, that's when you have things like wars to spread your own ideology. Lastly, why do we way over opening, right? I think from like opening, we get this idea about free market benefits. We give you specific mecs for why this happens in op world through like raising entrepreneurial incentives because no one wants to go against the government. Secondly, they tell us about like better international relations. We tell you how it's in their world where you necessarily alienate the developed and developing countries, and like we think that we outframe them by taking the context of developing countries and also like countries where you have majoritarian leaders. We think this framing weighs over in their metrics because of just like likeliness, because some countries will still be neoliberal. These will be countries like the US or the West because these ideologies originate there in the first place, and like the motion tells us imposition. So we think that our framing is more likely, and we show you that we literally do get democracy as well. With that, I conclude my speech. Thank you.
Great. I thank that speaker for that fine speech. I thank all speakers for what was a fine debate. Just one final round of applause virtually for all speakers for making it this far once again. Congratulations. We will have the results to you at the announcements before the grand final.
Thank you for judging us. Good debate.
Thank you. Good round.
Thank you. Good round.
Could we just get the recording turned off, please?